This is Strides to Solutions podcast. I'm your host, Esther Adams. There's a piece of advice that shows up almost everywhere emotional well being gets discussed. Name it to tame it. Say the word for what you are feeling, and the feeling itself will start to loosen its grip. It sounds almost too simple to be real, and yet there is genuine science behind it. Researchers have a term for this act of putting language on an emotional state. They call it affect labeling, and for years it has been treated as one of the more reliable tools in the emotion regulation toolbox. Say anxious out loud, or write it down, or even just think the word deliberately, and something in the nervous system responds. But here is where the story gets more interesting than the slogan suggests. When researchers looked closely at what happens in the brain and in a person's subjective experience when they name an emotion, they found something that does not fit neatly into the name it to tame it narrative. In some conditions, naming an emotion does seem to soften it. In other conditions, naming the emotion first can actually make it harder to shift afterward. The same act applied at a different moment or with a different level of precision can produce close to opposite effects. That contradiction is where today's episode lives. We are going to look at what naming an emotion is actually doing inside the brain, why the evidence is more tangled than the popular version of this idea admits, and what determines whether putting a word on a feeling helps you move through it or locks it more firmly in place. Let's start with the basic phenomenon because it is worth understanding clearly before we complicate it. Affect labeling refers to the act of attaching a linguistic label, a word, to an emotional stimulus or to your own internal state. Researchers studying this have proposed that it draws on something called core affect theory. The idea behind core affect theory is that emotions are not preset packages that arrive already labeled. Instead, the brain registers raw bodily sensations, things like a change in heart rate, a tightening in the chest, a shift in breathing, and then classifies those sensations using whatever conceptual knowledge of emotion the person already has. In other words, your body gives you data and your mind interprets that data using categories it has learned. Anger, sadness, embarrassment, none of those are hardwired readouts. They are interpretations built from raw physiological signal plus a person's existing emotional vocabulary. If that is true, then the words you have available to you are not just descriptions after the fact. They are part of how the emotional experience actually gets constructed. This is why researchers care so much about what they call emotion differentiation, sometimes referred to as emotional granularity. It is the ability to distinguish between emotional states that are related but not identical. Someone with high granularity can tell the difference between frustration, disappointment, and irritation. Someone with lower granularity might collapse all three into a single broad category, something like just feeling bad. The theoretical claim is that finer distinctions give a person better information, and better information should support better regulation, because you cannot address a problem accurately if you cannot describe it accurately. So, the underlying mechanism researchers have proposed involves two things happening more or less at the same time. First, the act of labeling draws attention away from the raw, immediate experience of the emotion. You shift from feeling the sensation directly to observing and naming it, which is a subtly different cognitive stance. Second, verbalization moves the experience into a more abstract format. Instead of being fully inside the feeling, you are describing the feeling, and that description creates what researchers call psychological distance between you and the emotional state. Distance in this context does not mean denial or suppression. It means a kind of observational space opens up between the raw sensation and your sense of self. And that space is thought to make the emotion feel more manageable, less overwhelming, more like something you are looking at rather than something you are drowning in. There is also a second pathway researchers have proposed, working somewhat in parallel with the distancing effect. Because differentiation gives you a more accurate read on what you are actually experiencing, it can support a completely separate regulation strategy called cognitive reappraisal. Reappraisal is the process of reinterpreting the meaning of whatever triggered the emotion in the first place. If you can correctly identify that what you are feeling is disappointment about a specific outcome rather than a vaguer sense of failure, you are in a much better position to reappraise the situation accurately because you know exactly what you are reappraising. So, in theory, labeling supports regulation through two separate channels. It creates distance on its own, and it improves the accuracy of whatever regulation strategy comes next. Now, here is where the researchers went looking for evidence inside the brain, and this is where the story starts to complicate itself. A study using a brain imaging method called functional near infrared spectroscopy, which tracks blood oxygenation changes in the outer layers of the cortex, looked at what happens when people combine affect labeling with reappraisal compared to using reappraisal by itself. The regions of interest were parts of the prefrontal cortex, specifically the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex on both sides of the brain and the right ventral lateral prefrontal cortex. These are regions broadly associated with executive control, the kind of top down cognitive effort involved in monitoring, evaluating, and adjusting your own mental states. What the researchers found was that labeling combined with reappraisal produced greater activation in these prefrontal regions than reappraisal alone. On the surface, that sounds like confirmation. More engagement from the brain's control centers, more regulatory effort being deployed. If you stop the story there, it would fit the popular narrative perfectly. Naming your emotion recruits more brain power toward managing it. But the researchers did not stop there because they also measured how people actually felt afterward, the subjective, self reported intensity of their negative emotion. And this is the part that upends the tidy version of the story. Despite the increased prefrontal activation, the combination of labeling and reappraisal was actually less effective at reducing subjective negative emotion than reappraisal used on its own. People's brains were working harder in the specific sense of showing more activity in regions tied to cognitive control, and yet they were coming out the other side feeling worse, not better, compared to people who simply reappraise the situation without labeling their emotion first. That is a genuinely strange finding, and it is worth sitting with for a moment because it cuts against a fairly common assumption people make about the relationship between effort and outcome. We tend to think that if the brain is working harder at something, that extra effort should translate into a better result. This study suggests that is not automatically true, at least not here. More prefrontal engagement did not mean better emotional outcomes. In some cases, it appeared to accompany worse ones. So, what explains that mismatch? The researchers proposed something they call the crystallization hypothesis. And I think this is one of the more important ideas in this whole area of research because it directly complicates the simple advice to just name what you are feeling. The crystallization hypothesis suggests that when you put a verbal label on an emotion, you are not just observing it from a slight distance. You are also, in a sense, solidifying it. Verbalizing an emotional state may make that state more structured, more defined, more resistant to being reshaped afterward compared to the more fluid, less codified experience of core affect before it gets language attached to it. Once you have said this is anxiety or this is anger, the cognitive evaluation tied to that specific label can become entrenched. And if entrenchment happens before you attempt to reappraise the situation, meaning before you try to reinterpret what the triggering event actually means, that entrenchment can limit how many alternative interpretations feel available to you. You have already locked the experience into a particular shape, and reshaping something that is already fixed is harder than reshaping something that is still forming. Put in more everyday terms, imagine you are upset after a difficult conversation with a colleague. If you immediately say to yourself, I am furious, before you try to think through what actually happened and why, that label of fury may become the frame you are now stuck reasoning from. Every subsequent attempt to reinterpret the situation has to work against the anchor of I am furious, rather than approaching the raw experience with more openness. Compare that to a version where you sit with the discomfort briefly, start reasoning through what happened and why, and let a more precise or more flexible understanding of your reaction emerge partly through that reasoning process itself. The sequencing matters. Naming first, then interpreting, appears to behave differently than interpreting, then naming, or then naming as part of a more integrated process rather than an isolated first step. I want to be careful here because the researchers themselves are careful about this. No definitive conclusion has been reached regarding the precise mechanism by which affect labeling regulates emotion. This is an active, somewhat contested area, not a settled one. The crystallization hypothesis is a compelling explanation for a genuinely observed pattern, but it remains a hypothesis, and the same body of research points out that the psychological distancing explanation, while intuitive, has never been conclusively demonstrated either. Both ideas are plausible, both have some support. Neither has been proven in a way that closes the question. There is another layer here worth adding, which comes from research into how different regulation strategies perform depending on how intense the triggering emotion is. This is sometimes called the emotion regulation asymmetry phenomenon, and the basic finding is that reappraisal tends to work better for lower intensity emotional situations, while distraction, meaning shifting attention away from the source of the emotion rather than reinterpreting it, tends to work better for higher intensity situations. This matters for our topic because it suggests that whether labeling helps or hurts might also depend on how intense the emotional experience already is when the labeling happens. A person calmly and reflectively naming a mild frustration is doing something quite different, cognitively, than a person in the middle of an intense emotional spike trying to name what is happening to them in real time. Before we move on, I want to add one more piece to this developmental picture because it changes how we should think about labeling, not as a technique you either have or do not have, but as something with roots that reach back much earlier than most people assume. There is longitudinal research tracking children's early ability to label difficult emotions and then following those same children forward into late adolescence. What the researchers found was that children who were better able to label emotional stimuli early in life went on to show better parent reported emotion regulation years later, and more strikingly, showed greater activation in cognitive control regions of the brain during a task that required them to actively regulate sadness. Recognition of specific emotions, fear and surprise in particular, predicted activation in a cluster of regions that included the insula, the anterior cingulate cortex, the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, and the inferior frontal gyrus, areas broadly involved in monitoring internal states and exerting cognitive control over them. This is a prospective study, meaning the labeling ability was measured first in early childhood, well before the regulation outcomes it predicted, which gives it more weight than a study that simply measures both things at the same moment and looks for a correlation. It suggests that the capacity for precise emotional labeling is not just a tool you deploy in the moment. It may be something closer to a skill that gets built early, that shapes how certain neural circuits develop and get recruited, and that continues paying dividends or continues exacting costs if it is underdeveloped well into later life. That earlier finding also helps make sense of something that might otherwise seem like a contradiction. If labeling can sometimes crystallize an emotion and make it harder to shift, why would early labeling ability predict better regulation many years down the line? I think the resolution is that we are talking about two different things operating on two different timescales. In the moment, the sequencing of labeling relative to reappraisal appears to matter quite a bit, and mistimed labeling can work against you. But developmentally, having a well built capacity for differentiation, meaning a rich enough internal vocabulary and enough practice using it, appears to shape the underlying neural architecture in a way that supports better regulation broadly, independent of any single moment's sequencing. A well developed skill can still be misapplied in a specific instance. That is true of almost any capacity, physical or cognitive, and it appears to be true here as well. There is one more strand of research worth mentioning before we move to specificity, because it speaks directly to a question a lot of people ask once they hear about the benefits of a richer emotional vocabulary, which is whether you can simply train it. Researchers tested a scaffolding approach where people were given closed ended emotion word prompts first, essentially a menu of possible labels, followed by an open ended opportunity to describe their state in their own words. This scaffolding did meaningfully enhance emotion differentiation for negative emotional experiences. People got better, in a measurable way, at telling their negative emotions apart. But when the researchers looked for a corresponding improvement in broader psychological symptoms, they did not find one. The scaffolding changed how precisely people could describe what they were feeling in the moment without translating into a detectable shift in overall psychological health. This is an important caution against assuming that granularity is a straightforward lever you can pull, where more training and labeling automatically produces more well being on some other measure entirely. The relationship between the specific skill of differentiation and the broader outcome of feeling better appears to be more indirect and possibly more conditional than that. Let's turn now to specificity, because this is the piece that connects most directly to the phrase you might have heard, emotional granularity. If naming an emotion at all has this complicated relationship with regulation, what happens when we ask a more precise question? Does naming an emotion with a more specific word rather than a vague one change the outcome? The general theoretical expectation, going back to the idea of core affect and conceptual knowledge, is that finer grained labels should help because they carry more accurate information about what is actually happening and why. Someone who can say, I feel disappointed, rather than I feel bad, has access to a more specific piece of information, and specific information should, in theory, support more targeted and more effective regulation. Individuals with higher emotional granularity tend to use differentiated words, things like excited, jealous, or miserable, while individuals with lower granularity lean on broad, undifferentiated terms like good or bad. And there is meaningful evidence connecting granularity to better regulatory outcomes across several different lines of research. Higher granularity has been associated with lower levels of general emotion dysregulation. It has been associated with greater flexibility in choosing regulation strategies that fit the context. It has even been linked to differences in brain activity, with people who have richer emotional vocabularies showing distinct patterns of engagement in regions associated with cognitive control when they process emotional material. But when researchers looked more closely at exactly where granularity was making its difference, they found something that complicates the simple version of this story, too. It turns out that having a more specific emotional vocabulary does not seem to change much about which regulation strategy a person chooses to use. What it changes is whether the chosen strategy actually works once it is deployed. In other words, granularity is not primarily about picking the right tool from the toolbox. It is about how effectively you can use whichever tool you have already picked up. People with lower granularity were not selecting worse strategies. They were implementing their strategies less successfully, and their attempts at regulation were more strongly associated with an intensification of negative emotion rather than a reduction of it. This distinction between selection and implementation matters more than it might sound like at first. It reframes what a rich emotional vocabulary is actually doing for a person. It is not handing you a better decision tree for which coping strategy to reach for in a given moment. It is giving you a more precise instrument to work with once you have already decided what you are going to try. And precision of instrument seems to make a real difference to whether the strategy lands. There's also a cognitive resource tied up in all of this that is easy to overlook, which is working memory. Individuals with higher emotional granularity tend to have relatively higher working memory capacity, and working memory is closely connected to a person's overall capacity for emotion regulation. This raises an interesting possibility, which is that emotional granularity might not be a purely independent skill that you can train in isolation and expect regulation benefits to automatically follow. It may be entangled with a broader set of cognitive resources, meaning that improving vocabulary alone, without any accompanying support for working memory or executive function, might not deliver the full benefit researchers have observed when granularity and cognitive capacity develop together. This connects to something else worth mentioning, which is that emotional granularity does not appear to work the same way for every kind of emotion. There is research on what is sometimes called construal level, essentially the level of abstraction at which an emotion is processed. Basic or primary emotions, the kind tied to a fairly direct, concrete appraisal of a situation, seem to respond well to the distancing effect that comes from putting language and abstraction between yourself and the raw feeling. But more complex emotions, things like self conscious emotions such as shame or guilt, or emotions like anxiety that are bound up in more elaborate appraisals about the future or about the self, behave differently. For these higher level emotions, psychological distance does not reliably reduce their intensity, and in some analyses, the effect trends in the opposite direction, meaning distance may not soften these more complex states, and could even, in certain conditions, sharpen them. Two separate meta analyses converged on this pattern. A distance perspective meaningfully reduced the intensity of low level, basic emotions, while its effect on high level, self conscious, or complex emotions was much weaker and, in some analyses, reversed. The proposed explanation for this split is almost elegant once you see it. Abstract processing, the kind of mental stance you take when you step back and label or describe something rather than experience it directly, is a mismatch for basic emotions, which are rooted in a fairly concrete, immediate appraisal of what is happening. That mismatch is exactly what creates the calming distance. But complex, self conscious emotions are already built out of abstract appraisal. Shame, for instance, often involves an abstract judgment about who you are as a person, not just a concrete reaction to an immediate event. When you apply more abstraction on top of an emotion that is already fundamentally abstract in its structure, you are not creating a mismatch that produces distance. You may instead be reinforcing the very cognitive process that generated the emotion in the first place. This is a genuinely important distinction because it means the advice to name your emotions cannot be applied uniformly across every kind of feeling and expect the same result. Now, let's talk about who this seems to fail for, because the research on this is fairly specific, and I think it matters more than the success stories usually get repeated in popular coverage of this topic. Individuals with lower emotional granularity do not simply fail to receive the benefit that higher granularity individuals get. There is evidence that they experience something closer to the opposite. Attempting to use a regulation strategy was more strongly associated with an intensification of negative emotion among people with poorer emotional differentiation. This is a meaningfully different finding than saying granularity has no effect for these individuals. It suggests that for people who already struggle to distinguish between emotional states, the act of trying to regulate without the differentiated vocabulary to do it precisely can make things worse rather than neutral. Adolescents show a related pattern, and there is something almost counterintuitive buried in the developmental research here. Emotional granularity does not increase in a straight line as people age. It appears to follow something closer to a U-shaped trajectory, meaning it can decline during adolescence relative to earlier childhood, even as other cognitive capacities are generally maturing. Combine that dip in granularity with working memory and emotion recognition abilities that are also still developing during this period, and you get a population where the tools required to make labeling genuinely regulatory are, for a stretch of development, less reliably available. There is also research showing that acute population level stress can degrade emotional granularity further. During a period of widespread stress, adolescents whose granularity dropped the most during the acute phase reported the highest levels of social anxiety and depressive symptoms afterward. Stress does not just make emotions more intense, it appears to make the tools people would normally use to name and differentiate those emotions less available exactly when they are needed most. Cultural context adds another layer that I think gets left out of the popular conversation about naming emotions almost entirely. One study looked at whether differentiating emotions helps regardless of which emotions a person is differentiating, or whether it matters which emotions are culturally valued. What they found was that differentiation only predicted meaningful health benefits, including reduced rumination, when the emotions being differentiated were the ones a person's culture treats as socially appropriate to engage with. For the individuals in the study who were of Korean cultural background, differentiating what researchers call socially engaging emotions predicted benefit. For individuals of European American background, differentiating socially disengaging emotions predicted benefit instead. Differentiating culturally disfavored emotions, the ones a given cultural context tends to discourage attending to, did not predict the same benefits. This suggests that emotional granularity is not a context free skill that works the same way everywhere for everyone. It is shaped by and possibly dependent on what a person's surrounding culture treats as legitimate territory for emotional attention in the first place. There is also research connecting weaker emotional differentiation to something you might not expect to see in this conversation at all, which is belief in conspiracy theories. People who endorse conspiracy theories show a reduced ability to distinguish between negative emotional states, and this reduced granularity is connected to a reliance on less adaptive emotion regulation strategies. I want to be careful about how I frame this because the research does not establish that poor emotional differentiation causes conspiracy belief or the reverse. What it does suggest is that the capacity to make fine distinctions among your own negative emotional states may be entangled with broader patterns of cognitive processing, including how a person tolerates uncertainty and ambiguity. And that entanglement shows up in unexpected corners of psychological research. Executive function is another individual difference worth mentioning, specifically the working memory component of it. People with stronger working memory related executive function show more flexibility in switching between regulation strategies. For instance, moving from reappraisal to distraction when a situation calls for it, particularly under conditions of higher emotional intensity. This connects back to something we touched on earlier. The relationship between naming an emotion and successfully regulating it is not purely about vocabulary. It sits inside a broader ecosystem of cognitive resources, and someone's capacity to benefit from a precise emotional label may depend partly on capacities that have nothing directly to do with language at all. I also want to mention something that complicates the picture from a completely different angle, which is how ambiguous the underlying task of labeling actually is, even under close to ideal conditions. Research on the reliability of emotional labeling, in this case looking at how consistently different human observers agree on emotional content, found inter-rater agreement of only around 36%. That is a strikingly low number for a task most of us assume has a fairly obvious right answer. If trained observers working from the outside cannot reliably agree on what emotion is present in a given piece of material, it is worth holding some humility about how cleanly any of us, working from the inside of our own nervous system, are able to select the single correct word for what we are feeling in a given moment. This does not mean labeling is useless. It means the confidence with which the popular version of this advice gets delivered, just name it as though the correct name is simply sitting there waiting to be retrieved, probably overstates how determinate the underlying process really is. There is a related finding about how much context shapes what gets labeled in the first place, even when we are talking about something as seemingly direct as reading a facial expression. Identical facial expressions get labeled differently depending on the surrounding context, and this appears to happen at very early stages of processing, meaning it is not a later deliberate override of an initial read. Context resolves emotional ambiguity before you are even consciously reasoning about it. This reinforces the same underlying idea from a different direction. Emotional labeling, whether of someone else's face or your own internal state, is not a passive readout of a fixed pre existing signal. It is an active, context sensitive act of interpretation constructed in real time from whatever information, internal and external, happens to be available. So, where does this leave us? I think it is worth being honest about the actual shape of the evidence here rather than resolving it into a tidier conclusion than the research supports. Affect labeling, naming an emotion, clearly does something. It changes patterns of activation in prefrontal regions associated with cognitive control. It creates, at least for many basic and moderately intense emotional states, a form of psychological distance that appears to make the experience feel more manageable. And having a more differentiated, specific emotional vocabulary is reliably associated with better regulatory outcomes across a fairly wide range of studies, largely because that specificity seems to improve how effectively a chosen regulation strategy gets carried out, rather than which strategy gets chosen in the first place. But the same evidence base also makes clear that this is not a universally reliable technique that works the same way for everyone in every emotional state at every moment. When labeling happens immediately before an attempt at reappraisal, it can crystallize the emotional state rather than loosen it, entrenching a particular interpretation before more flexible reinterpretation has a chance to occur. For complex, self conscious emotions built out of abstract appraisal in the first place, the distancing that helps with basic emotions may not translate the same way, and in some analyses trends the opposite direction. For people with lower baseline emotional granularity, attempting to regulate through labeling is associated with intensified negative emotion rather than relief, which suggests this is not a technique that automatically helps the people who might seem to need it most. Developmental stage, acute stress, cultural context, and even underlying working memory capacity all appear to shape whether naming an emotion functions the way the popular advice assumes it will. I think the most honest place to land is this. Naming an emotion is not a switch that reliably turns intensity down. It is closer to a tool whose effect depends heavily on when it is used, how precisely it is used, what kind of emotion it is being applied to, and what cognitive resources and cultural context a person brings to the moment of using it. The research has not yet mapped where the exact thresholds sit. There is essentially no study that has systematically varied the specificity of a label to find the point where more precision stops helping or starts creating a different kind of problem. And the deeper mechanism, whether this is fundamentally about distance, about crystallization, about competition for limited cognitive resources, or some combination of the three, remains genuinely unresolved in the field. What that means practically is something closer to this. If you find yourself reaching for a word to describe what you are feeling, the specificity of that word probably matters more than whether you have a word at all. Disappointed carries more useful information than bad, but the timing and the way you use that word also seem to matter. Naming an emotion as an isolated first move before you have given yourself any room to think through what actually happened and why may set that interpretation before you have had a chance to explore it. Naming an emotion as part of a more unfolding process where description and reflection move together rather than description locking in ahead of reflection appears to behave differently in the research, though I want to be honest that this is closer to an implication of the crystallization findings than something the studies tested directly and definitively. None of this means the advice to name your emotions is wrong. it means it is incomplete in a way that matters. The brain does not treat naming an emotion as a simple release valve. It treats it as an act of construction, one that draws on cognitive resources, cultural knowledge, developmental stage, and the surrounding context of the moment. And that construction can either open up space to reinterpret an experience or can quietly close that space down, depending on conditions the popular version of the advice rarely mentions. Understanding that complexity does not make the tool less useful. If anything, it makes it more useful because it tells you that when naming an emotion does not seem to help in a specific moment or for a specific feeling, that is not necessarily a sign you are doing it wrong. It may simply be a case where the timing, the specificity, or the kind of emotion involved sits outside the conditions under which this particular tool tends to work. That is where the evidence actually stands right now, somewhere between the simplicity of a wellness slogan and the full complexity of a nervous system that is still, in important ways, interpreting itself in real time. Thank you for spending this time with me. I'm Esther Adams, and this has been Strides to Solutions.